Well, it's definitely a flare-up again. It's not clear whether it is a turning point in this war. It all depends on the reaction of the UAE. What's been happening is that the UAE have been backing off from the conflict since the last attack on their significant assets in 2018. 2 years later, they started withdrawing, and they actually announced that they withdrew from the Yemen conflict, but they stayed. So far, they stayed with modest and rather limited strategic objectives of protecting the Strait of Mandeb and some of their oil facilities and oil access facilities. But in the last year, the Houthi rebels have made significant advances on government-held territory, and that prompted a reaction by the UAE to be further involved and actually rather massively involved through their proxies at the very least. And the Houthis do not like that because it is putting a definite stop and actually rolling back their recent waves of conquest. So that is why they are sending this message to the UAE: we can harm you. Now, whether the UAE will revert to their original position of we do not want to be harmed, we want to have modest strategic objectives, we do not want to be too much involved in these conflicts for a number of reasons. First, harm. Second, the reputational cost of being involved in such a bloody civil war, which is on the rebel side, is having a catastrophic civilian casualty toll, and indeed is creating the worst humanitarian crisis of the world, or whether they are going to be further involved in the conflict, which could change it.
And all this happening in the backdrop of ongoing and emerging reports of Iranian efforts to smuggle weapons and explosive material into Yemen. That seems to be an active operation on Iran's part.
Well, that's the thing. This is very hard to read on the part of Iran, because on the one hand, they are trying to move closer towards the UAE and towards the Gulf, and even Saudi Arabia for that matter. And at the same time, at the very least, they do not stop Houthis' activities in Yemen. So they are still in this kind of like sphere and this strategy of plausible deniability, which it is at this point impossible to link these two attacks directly towards Iran, although we do know that Houthis in general are using Iranian-made weapons. This plausible deniability is going to be much harder and harder for Iran to assume in the next couple of weeks if these attacks continue, and it's going to be interesting to see whether these Houthis attacks were just messages sent to the UAE, and Iran is going to say, look, stop now, this is harming us on a diplomatic front, and we've allowed you to do that because you had to make a statement for strategic reasons, or whether Iran is actually not serious about engaging with the UAE, not serious about engaging with the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, and we're moving back to logic of confrontation of blocks with UAE, Saudi Arabia on the one hand, and Iran and potentially Qatar on the other hand. I wouldn't bet on that. That doesn't sound to be the logic of history, but this might happen even if the actors the stakeholders do not actually want it.
Nathanael Chouraqui, Middle East analyst, thanks for being with us.